Hello, Year 13, and welcome back to the second part of our lesson on Graham Greene's story, The Destructors. Last time we looked very carefully at context, and you will recall we looked at the post-war context. This picture will remind you of London in ruins after the Blitz. This time we're going to be looking at the idea of symbolism. And if you recall, symbolism is when you take an object and you imbue it with much greater meaning. You extend it to have a power beyond itself. And in this particular story, I'm going to be suggesting to you that we can read The Destructors as a kind of condition of England story, in which the house and the actions of the boy seem to stand for what is happening in England and what is likely to happen in the future. You'll recall that much of the symbolism revolves around the idea of a Christopher Wren house. And I explained to you last time that Christopher Wren was this great architect. And in a way, he himself is symbolic of Britain's architectural heritage, the finest art, the most beautiful, aesthetic, pleasing things in Britain. And of course, the story revolves around the destruction of these. Possibly you may even see them as a kind of mindless destruction of these. So our learning questions will be, how does the angry young man emerge from the landscape of post-war Britain? We'll be looking at how you can use cultural context to enhance the analysis of the writer's use of language. But most importantly, we're going to have an AO5 focus, and that will be our plenary. That really is my whole lesson aim. We're going to look at how you can include multiple interpretation in your essays, something that students find hard. So what this video is going to do is it's going to give you many different ways of interpreting the story and the symbolism in particular. And we'll conclude by looking at which ones you find the most convincing and the most powerful. Now, Old Misery's house somehow survives this huge battering in the Second World War. But the house itself obviously is considerably weakened. It's held in place by wooden struts. The houses around it have been removed. In its fragile state, it needs support. And I'm going to suggest that this links to the political and social structure that it represents. It cannot stand as it once did, as an independent building of formidable strength, a building that represents Britain's imperial glory and the wealth and splendor of the upper classes. However, the interior is a trove of revered artifacts of civilized European culture. This is basically something from which the lower classes or the working classes have been excluded. To them, going into the house, as we see when we look at the gang of boys, they don't see the significance of this. It's not something that speaks to them. Now, one of the big questions, and we asked this last time, is how far destruction can be seen as creation. Now, let's not forget the members of the gang are 12 in number. And controversially, I'm going to suggest to you that Trevor could be seen as a kind of messiah figure, a leader. It may not be the kind of religious message that we're used to hearing, but it seems to me very interesting that Graham Greene makes them 12 in number. They are forces for change, whether they recognize this or not. What they do represents a kind of revolution. When they demolish the house, as we're going to see, it's incredibly systematically done. These are boys who usually are apathetic and do nothing but take rides on buses. When they have this project, they are absolutely single-mindedly committed to it. Paradoxically, they are as serious as artists. And there's no doubt that Trevor sees himself, ironically, as an artist. And Graham Greene, the narrator, actually asserts, destruction, after all, is a form of creation. One of the questions we'll be asking is Graham Greene sort of tacitly, secretly on the side of the boys? Very interesting thought for us to be thinking about. And I'm going to be suggesting that at the heart of this destruction is the idea of a class struggle. And we'll be looking at this particular symbol of the top hat, which Graham Greene uses on 2 occasions. We'll be looking at this very closely. Now, as regards class struggle, this is seen in Trevor. Interestingly enough, of course, Trevor is definitely posher and more middle class than the rest of the boys. But he's actually experienced a kind of catastrophic incident of downward mobility. We know that his father was an architect, but all of a sudden he finds himself with these working class characters. The other gang members can see that Trevor is different. Even his name, Trevor, produces laughter from them. And in the context, obviously, of post-war Britain, the name Trevor must have been seen as a middle-class name. They, of course, change this to T, which makes him a much more acceptable member of the gang. It gives him the kind of status that he needs. Trevor burns Mr. Thomas's life savings. And one of the ways that we could see this gesture, this symbolic gesture, is Trevor aligning himself with the gangs, rejecting privilege and rejecting his old class position. A group of people who would love this reading, of course, as we know from our studies, are Marxists, who believe that class struggle is at the center of all politics. You will recall this pyramid, which shows the poor old working class at the bottom, holding up the table of the greedy rich. They are oppressed by the soldiers who shoot them if they rebel. They are also oppressed by the church, who give them religion, or the opium of the people, as Marx called it. And of course, at the top of the pyramid, in terms of the human element of social stratification, are the kings. And these people all weigh down on the working class people. Interestingly enough, in the capitalist pyramid, money is at the top. Now, Trevor, of course, rejects money. He burns it and destroys it. Obviously, a Marxist critic would find this very interesting, very symbolic, possibly looking at it as an attack on capitalism. Now, the incident of burning money is absolutely central to the story. I think it's some of Graham Greene's finest writing is when he discusses how Trevor looks when he burns the money and the contempt with which he absolutely rejects money. Another thing which is absolutely at the center of the story, both symbolically and more explicitly, is that there is a fundamental clash between the old and the new, the older generation and the new generation. The older generation, as portrayed through the character Mr. Thomas, are weak, naive, and powerless. Even when he intends to be pleasant to the boys and gives them chocolate, his kindness is rejected and they are suspicious of him. The new generation is portrayed as selfish, cruel, violent, disrespectful, destructive, and unconcerned about their future. Who then will lead the way as England recovers from the war and looks to enter the future with some kind of strength, certainty, and promise? Well, Mr. Thomas certainly doesn't seem as though he's going to lead the way, because he's locked in the toilet and his house and home are destroyed, and he actually becomes a laughingstock at the end of the story. But neither do the boys look very promising for the future of England. Graham Greene leaves this question open. He offers no answer to us to this important question. Arguably, the future looks very bleak. And this leads us to the idea of the absurdity of life. Absurdism was a big movement in the arts of the 1950s, and the idea that life maybe is meaningless, characterized by randomness and misfortune, in making the young boys the main impetus behind all of the plot. Graham Greene reveals that oftentimes the clearest understanding of life emerges from immature minds. And this is strongly revealed in the final scene of the story, when a motorist stands next to Mr. Thomas as they both gaze over the ruins of the house, and the motorist laughs. The reader is left to wonder if there's any more significance to the destruction of the two homes that once stood next to Mr. Thomas. Is it a destruction of invaluable art, something beautiful that can't be replaced? Or is it simply a home, another home has fallen down, like so many other millions that other people across England endured. Now, another very interesting phenomenon in the 1950s, and we'll look at this in a lot more detail, and next week you'll be looking at a story called A Catcher in the Rye, which also deals with youth culture, is that during the 1950s in England, a lot of organized teenage groups who were very disrespectful, who were quite angry, began to gather, and they had a very unique culture. They called themselves teddy boys. They dressed in beautiful Edwardian clothes, but their behavior was actually often delinquent and destructive. In many ways, the precursors of modern gangs that we might see today, of different hooded top boys. These groups of boys were regarded as being incredibly unstable and violent. They got their name, as I said, from this Edwardian suits that they wore, and so they kind of combined delinquent behavior with real attention to their appearance. And to a lot of the older generation, they were horrified by these new confident teenagers who seemed to reject everything from the old world, in particular, rejecting the idea that you should give respect to elders. Now, this is something that we see very, very clearly in the story The Destructors. Now, the political context, as I said to you last time, is also very interesting, of course, because the defeat of the Conservatives was a massive moment. Now, after the Conservatives were defeated, the new Labour government nationalised the Bank of England, created the National Health Service, nationalised transport, nationalised power, in many ways set about taking a lot of property and capital from the rich and putting it into the state coffers. Now, out of this political situation, the Destructors grew. And maybe Graham Greene is using this political context to actually show that Trevor and the gang's actions could be symbolic on a macro level of what was happening to the economy and the country at large. Finally, and maybe most interestingly, another way of looking at Trevor's actions is to see it in the context of art. Now, this is a urinal which was placed in a gallery in Paris by a very famous French artist called Marcel Duchamp. And he belonged to a movement which was called Dadaism or Dada. And they believed that the gallery was dead. They despised old art, and they wanted nothing to do with the way that it was. So they set about provoking and angering traditional artistic values. And their view was that it was better to blow up the gallery and to start again. So when Marcel Duchamp put his urinal in the gallery, he really was sticking two fingers up at the arty establishment and saying, your art is worthless. Now, it seems to me a very interesting parallel with T, of course, who destroys this invaluable, beautiful Christopher Wren house. Is he really, in a sense, a kind of Dada artist who wants to destroy this art? One of the reasons why Dada hated the art was they saw it as elitist, as the property of a tiny elite. They wanted an art that would be more widespread, more in the street, more of the people. Now, taking a less social, political, and cultural view and focusing on the character instead of T, is it possible to see T as a psychopath? This is a very famous picture of Alex, a character in A Clockwork Orange, which is another book that we'll study later in the course. And it's another book in which adults seem absolutely terrified of psychopathic or semi-psychopathic teenagers. Now, what is a psychopath? Well, a psychopath is said to have very specific traits. Lack of remorse or guilt, never feeling sorry. This is certainly something we see from T when he destroys Mr. Thomas's house and locks him in the toilet. He even goes as far as to say it's nothing personal. I'm doing it, and he doesn't even give us any reasons. So we could see this as a heinous act and him not feeling bad in any way whatsoever. Other characteristics include shallow emotions, not really feeling anything or caring. callousness and a lack of empathy, failure to accept responsibility for one's own acts. The one thing against this thesis, of course, is that T doesn't go out to physically hurt or harm Mr. Thomas. Far from it. The boy's treated with quite a lot of concern. Locked in the toilet, he's fed with sausages, etc. Cruel, granted, but is this the behavior that we could call psychopathic? Well, this is a very interesting thing for you to think about. Now, I've offered you a number of different pieces of information. The choice for you now is to weigh these up. These pieces of information will give you different routes into the story. It will offer you different models for interpreting the story. And this is precisely what AO5 is. It means that you can juggle and play with different readings, put them alongside each other, evaluate them, and make preferences. So I hope that this short little lecture has given you ideas for interpreting the story, and it's made you see that AO5 is fascinating. If you put it at the center of your essay, it can get a genuine discussion going of how a text is polysemic, how it can be read in many different ways, and how you as a reader are expected to evaluate these, judge these, explore these, and come up with some kind of coherent answer. Thank you for listening.